Hello there, everybody, and welcome back to another Star Wars Lads tier list. This month, we are going to be doing Star Wars villains, kind of the ultimate Star Wars villains tier list. We're talking about 90 villains in this video, so it's going to be both a longer video, but also we're going to move through some of these lesser ones a little quicker. But before we get into these villains, please hit that like button down below and subscribe to our channel. We're on the march to 1,000 subs, so all of your subscriptions really count and will really help us move into the future with our channel and continue to give you guys even better Star Wars content. So if you haven't subbed and you're watching this video, please subscribe right now. Comment below, let us know who your picks for the top tiers would be or the bottom tiers. So before we get into this, since it is a longer tier list, I think we usually only do 5 in the S tier. I was thinking we can do 9 for this one. That's 10% of the list. We usually don't, our tier list is usually about 50 or less options. So that is a good amount for the S tier. So up to 9 in the S tier, as many as we want in all the other tiers. We will be running through some of these lesser villains quicker, and some of these names might get a little less time on the page, but we will be talking about all of them quite briefly. So let's bring in the tier list here. And Senek, who's our first villain?
Well, our first villain is Triple Zero. I think when he first came, it was a really fun villain for me. I like what he does with like with the 3PO sort of mentality, but making it dark. But I think some of the recurring appearances kind of wore me down on both the characters. I would say C tier villain.
I was going to go for B tier. I think amongst the villains here, I think he's upper half of the middle for me. If C is the lower half of the middle, I would put him in B.
Yeah, I mean I'm fine with him being like a B minus.
Next, we've got another droid. We've got 4 LOM, mostly in canon. I forgot to mention this at the beginning. We are sticking to canon for this tier list because if we did villains from all of Legends, this thing would be about 4 hours long. We will do a Legends villain tier list here in the future, hopefully. For 4 LOM, most of his appearance in canon, besides The Empire Strikes Back, are in the Bounty Hunters comic and the War of the Bounty Hunters miniseries. This character I enjoy, and I enjoy the dynamic with Zuckuss. Very iconic from The Empire Strikes Back mostly, but I would still say C tier.
I'd also agree with C tier, especially with the comics kind of fully fleshing out this character. Our next character is Admiral Konstantine. Admiral Konstantine's one of the naval commanders that we see in Rebels who's not exactly up to the task of dealing with the Ghost crew. I would give him a D.
I'd agree. D. Constantine, while not a bad character, is kind of the one of the most inferior of all of these Imperial officers we're going to talk about. Moving on to another pretty incompetent Imperial officer, we have Admiral Ozzel from The Empire Strikes Back. Comes out of Lightspeed too close to planet Hoth. I would also say D for Ozzel.
Yeah, I think he has one of the most iconic scenes in Empire Strikes Back. It just so happens to be that it's also his death scene. I don't know. I'd go with the same rating, honestly. Moving on, let's go with Admiral Piett. Probably like the most hardworking, honest Imperial guy in the original trilogy. I don't know. I find it a little difficult to say he's like a villain's villain. Like he is evil by being part of the Empire. I find this one a little tricky because if we're talking about competence, he's probably like a B tier level villain. But if we're talking about like being evil and truly villainous, he's kind of like a D tier at best. So maybe you split the difference and go with C.
I'm okay with that. I was also going to say B because of his competence, but yeah, I get that point about the truly villainous aspects of Piet. But then that moves us to Admiral Trench from the Clone Wars. Admiral Trench is one of the more iconic characters, I would say, from the Clone Wars, or at least characters that don't have a significant role in the series. I still like what he does a lot. I'd say probably B.
I also like that he has like these cybernetics to his arachnoid features that come in later. I'd go with B. I do like his visual design. It really pops out. And then from there, we can move on to Agent Kallus. Introduced in Star Wars Rebels, was like our season one villain. He's competent. I'd say anyone who can survive a Thrawn watching all your moves, right? And still do enough to get away fairly unscathed. That's pretty good. I'd go for a B.
I'd also say B in terms of his villainousness. I think he's a great character. Maybe if we were talking characters, he might jump towards A, but a lot of that has to do with his rounding out to becoming part of the rebellion. So I think in terms of villain, he's probably towards the top of B. So next we have Agent Terex, who's been one of the main villains of the Poe Dameron line. Terex has a really cool look. His role is also pretty strong. So I'm either good with bottom of B or top of C.
I would say bottom of beef for me. And Terex's whole backstory, like surviving Jakku, working for the First Order as like an exclusive agent, also idolizing the Empire and like talking trash to Phasma and everyone else. Yeah, B minus for me. And then moving on, probably one of the most memorable villains ever in Star Wars, about the legends and canon. That's Asajj Ventress. Honestly, I think I just have to say first S tier out of here. I mean, she has such iconic fights and deaths and everything. I mean, her whole story is amazing. Yeah, her turn isn't because she wanted to be good. Her turn is because Dooku abandoned her to die. We talk about the Clone Wars as being mature and having darker stuff going on. Nothing was as dark as, in my mind, as Asajj Ventress kissing the commander on Kamino in season 2 and stabbing him with her lightsaber. Definitely S tier.
Yeah, I'd agree. S tier, especially in the extended S tier we're doing in this video. She's Star Wars' best female villain. And I think the villainous part of her is one of the things that makes her most unique. So definitely S tier. So now we talk about Aurra Sing, another character who was exponentially expanded upon in the Clone Wars after first appearing in The Phantom Menace. Aura's appearances in the Clone Wars I thought were fantastic. One of the standout villains, especially of the early few seasons of the Clone Wars. I'd say maybe A tier for Aurra Sing, but I'd be okay with B tier.
Yeah, she's a character who has like dense amounts of content and expansion of her character over very small time periods. She's got a great look with antennas sticking out of her head. But then there's not really much after her abandonment of Boba. Like she's mentioned, she's seen a few times here and there. So I'd go for B tier. And then we can move on to Barriss Offee. And Barriss Offee is a villain at the very end of season 5 of the Clone Wars. Her turn, so to speak, is, I don't know. I find it even today a little jarring that it just happened like that. I feel like we could have seen maybe an arc with her again before that eventual turn. I would say C tier. She's not too affected at the end of the day.
I was gonna say C tier as well, just because of a lack of content for her as a villain, but I would really like to see more and hopefully maybe a post Order 66 like she escaped and we get to see some of her in the Bad Batch because I think she could be a really great villain. So next we have Bib Fortuna, kind of like a parody villain. I love what Bib Fortuna's role is. I think he works so well in Return of the Jedi, and then also just as fodder for Boba Fett's eventual rise at the end of Mandalorian season 2. Could I say he's a great villain? No, but I do like him more than these Imperials. I'd say bottom of C.
Yeah, I can agree with Bottom C. I also like seeing him like all fattened up in the Book of Boba Fett, like well, the end of Mando season 2, leading into his death. It did seem like he was competent enough, but not competent enough to do anything but keep things together, which is why everything is chaotic in Book of Boba Fett when he comes and steps into place. Where our next villain is Black Krrsantan, and Black Krrsantan, I don't know. For me, he is one of those villains that he's definitely a character both in the comics from his gladiatorial days and in Book of Boba Fett who kind of revels in being the villain. Like he loves ripping people's arms off. He loves fighting. I don't know. I'm conflicted. Maybe bottom of A or top of B for me.
Yeah, I was gonna say A for sure. I think his comic appearances are iconic. One of the most standout characters from the canon comic lines. And then his appearance in Book of Boba Fett is one of the things that I think is most consistently good about that show as a whole. I think he's definitely an A. Moving on to Boba Fett, this is a tougher one than it really should have been or should be, really. The comics are one of the things that's definitely making me on the border between S and A. I think it boosts his villain status, but Book of Boba Fett turns him into an anti-hero and more honestly closer to hero than anti-hero. And so that's where I'm even wavering on Boba Fett. If we would have done this list last year, with an extended, 9-person S tier, I would have said probably bottom of S, but it's close for me. And I don't know what you think between S and A.
I still find him to be an S tier character. Maybe now barely so, versus before he was locked in as like a top S character. Villains have to have some cool like scars or armor or something. He's always got that. But when it comes to Book of Boba Fett, you're right. He's more anti-hero, if not outright hero at this point. But I think the ending with Cad Bane is what keeps me optimistic. Very bottom of best right now, though. And our next character is BT1, one of the duo with Trip Zero. I have a little bit even more conflicted feelings with BT1. At least with Triple Zero, you can actually understand him. BT1 just kind of is there after a while for me. I would put him a C tier. I don't really find him too appealing. He's cool at the start, but not much else.
I would also put him C tier. Lack of character compared to Triple Zero because you can't understand what he says. Next, we have Cad Bane, who I would also suggest for S tier. I think Cad Bane is at this point now with what Book of Boba Fett has done to both Boba Fett and Cad Bane. I think Cad Bane's our most consistently villainous bounty hunter we've had throughout canon. I would say Cad Bane and S, probably behind Ventress and in front of Boba Fett.
Yeah, I would agree with that placement. Especially his return in Book of not Book of Boba Fett, his return in the Bad Batch is so good to me, especially his shootout scene. I really enjoy what we got from the Cad Bane in the Book of Boba Fett. I just wish he was a little bit more of a central villain. Our next villain is a villain that you might have not remembered, but it's Captain Canady from the beginning of The Last Jedi. Probably the most competent First Order naval officer. Like, I could see him like a bottom of B.
I was gonna say C towards the bottom of C, but that's mainly because of the lack of screen time. I can definitely see a long storied career in the First Order Navy for Captain Kennedy, the way he stares down the fire that is about to kill him. I would say C tier.
If we get a little bit more, I could see him go up, but not right now.
All right. Well, next we have Captain Phasma. Phasma has been explored further in novels and comics. Particularly the Phasma novel, I think, is really good and does showcase her as a villain quite well. We're talking about just the film appearances. I think she's effective in the scenes that she's given, but obviously far too little screen time to make much impact. And kind of that air of disappointment with the lack of character development in the films has always kind of surrounded her. I think for the Phasma book alone, though, I still would go C.
So it's interesting for me because I haven't actually read the Phasma book. I've heard a lot about the characters, the connections to Batu and stuff like Cardinal and all that, being like this warrior who can live forever and ever. I mean, that is kind of where she came from. But again, it is, I wish we got to see her developed in the movies. Yeah, C tier. Our next character with very shiny First Order armor is Commander Pyre. I really liked how he was used because for me, even though Resistance is only 2 seasons, it's just the back half of season one that really truly convinced me that that could have been a show with potential. I would push for bottom of B.
I don't think I could give him a higher rating than Phasma. Like I think Phasma is more interesting in the expanded material. But I would say C. He does have a solid presence, but he doesn't have that much character, I would say. So
No, that's fair.
Zara, Commander Zara is next. Commander Zara has been a more recent villain who was explored in Charles Soule's Star Wars run. I've really enjoyed the Commander Zara arc. I thought that was some of the most interesting stuff that Charles Soule has done throughout his work on Star Wars. And I would probably push for bottom of B for Commander Zara.
Yeah, I think having a direct connection to Tarkin, and a little bit of the backstory showcased. I wish we had a little bit more time with her, but maybe we had plenty of time with her, and it's just the gap that kind of threw me off. But I'd go bottom of B as well. Our next villain is Count Dooku. Count Dooku is an interesting case for me because I think a lot of the new canon material has really developed him in fun ways. We didn't get enough of the complexity of the man ever truly explored outside of Dooku Jedi Lost in the Clone Wars. I really enjoy his fighting style, enjoy his banter with Anakin and Obi-Wan. I really enjoy all their scenes that they share together. That is really what is the basis of his character. I can't wait to see more of him in Qui-Gon. But I think he's only an A. I don't think he's an S tier character.
Again, looking at the rest of the list, I'm having a hard time deciding who are going to be the bottom of S characters. I think Dooku is right on that bubble. I'd agree, though, his most development comes from when he's a Jedi in terms of his true internal character depth, like from novels that we've gotten so far. But the Clone Wars really elevates him. I'll go with top of A right now as well, and I want to see which other characters are going to be on that SA bubble. So next we have Count Vidian. Count Vidian was the villain of the first ever Star Wars canon book, A New Dawn. Count Vidian's design, I think, is very, very cool. I really have always liked the way this character looks. And I think he's quite memorable for a book that I feel like is, not one of the best canon books, is relatively like slightly above average. I'd say B tier for me.
Yeah, I'd agree. I know there was like a lot of hype for what his character was gonna showcase off in the little excerpts coming out, and he's probably the engine for that whole thing. He's quite compelling. His kind of relationship with his technology is also like it's a very interesting angle to take that. It felt very mature, and I thought a lot of the book took maturity of these characters that we've seen in more animated versions or comics, and I thought that was very memorable. I'd agree. He's a B tier for sure. Our next villain is also relatively recent, Crosshair. And Crosshair for me has been the best part of like the villainous side of the Bad Batch so far. I would push for bottom of A, honestly. I think so far he's been quite a fun villain, and I'm excited to see what he does, especially with Commander Cody around.
I'd agree. I think with the depth that he's been given already in season one, and I'm sure he'll be a continued villain throughout most of the Bad Batch with probably a heroic turn towards the end of the show. I think he's going to, this might be a preemptive pick, but I think he is going to turn into one of our favorite animated villains from the Clone Wars style. I think bottom of A is a good choice. So next we have Darth Maul, who has become one of the most fleshed out Star Wars villains of all time after a quick death in the Phantom Menace. Easily an S tier for me, probably top of S based on who we have now.
Yeah, don't really have much to add there. Just a huge fan of the Son of the Dathomir comics. And then our next character after Darth Maul, Darth Momin. And you might not really know who Darth Momin is, but he's probably one of the most interesting Darths ever. Charles Soule plays him off as but a bit more of a dark side minded architect, a fanatic devotion to art, even though his art does involve like murdering whole planets and stuff like that. Awesome character. I would honestly push for bottom of A just because of how memorable he is.
That's another one that, despite his lack of true exploration, as a lead in anything in canon, I would also say bottom of A. I think he's such a fascinating character, and I want to learn more and more about him. So next, we have one of my favorite characters of all time, and for me, the top of S tier right now, Darth Sidious. I think as a villain, especially if we're exploring pure villainy, Darth Sidious has been made with the Rise of Skywalker the villain of the entire saga, all 9 movies, even the architect of the First Order, the Final Order. He's the ultimate villain in Star Wars. And while he might not have as many arcs or as many sides to him as a Vader or a Maul, he is the craziest, nuttiest, wackiest, most insanely evil person in Star Wars. For me, he's the top of S.
I agree. He's he's just good fun, man. But what we've gotten, especially his reappearance in Rebels, is very memorable to me. Even if you don't love the Rise of Skywalker, he's so iconic with his base boosted lightning. That was so fun to see in theaters. Our next character is probably the more iconic bad of this entire series, and that is Darth Vader. I don't have to say anything. S tier.
Absolutely S tier. And as much as I love Palpatine, Vader is arguably the greatest character in Star Wars, both as Anakin and as Vader. There's been so much depth throughout comics, video games, movies, TV shows. Vader is basically the heart and soul of Star Wars. But unfortunately, since we don't have much of anything about Darth Bane or Darth Plagueis, or even characters that are hinted to be canon like Revan or Nihilus, those characters are not on our list because we are focusing on canon. But we're going to move on to Dengar, who has taken a villainous turn more so in the Bounty Hunters line again. Dengar has kind of, like most of our original Empire Strikes Back bounty hunters, played both hero and villain throughout Star Wars canon, but he seems to take a more villainous turn than almost all the rest of those characters. He is kind of dumb, but I would say bottom of B or top of C.
I really like his role in the heist sort of situation in the Clone Wars. But then there's the whole possibility of him turning into Rot Dengar. Kind of disturbs me about a character. I will go with a C. I've enjoyed some of his recanonization of some of his backstory. And then our next character after Dengar is a High Republic character, but we have seen her over many years because her species apparently lives for hundreds of years, and that's Deva Lompop. Deva Lompop is a character I wish we've gotten more out of. She's got an interesting aesthetic. I kind of like a villain that's like also like so villainous but also so vain, and she kind of seems like someone who like takes care of herself and her looks and all that. I would say bottom of C.
Yeah, I agree. She's been more flash than substance. C tier for sure. Next, we have director Orson Krennic. Orson Krennic is one of the best parts of Rogue One. Ben Mendelsohn's turn as this character really stands out, and I also have always really loved the Catalyst novel, and Krennic is one of the easy standouts of that entire novel. I think he's an A tier for me, one of my favorite Imperial officers.
He was great in the movie. I think I find it funny in Lost Stars and all of these other materials that kind of reference his character as he's coming up. But like you said, he's got some iconic stuff like with Vader, his ending being killed by his own project is amazing. And even if I haven't read anything from Catalyst, I know enough about it that makes me treat him as an A villain. Moving on, we have Dryden Vos, and Dryden Vos is a character. I'll put it like that. He's probably one of the more forgettable parts of the solo, but he doesn't do much for me. His fight scene is fine. C tier.
C tier also for me. He's an average main Star Wars villain, and amongst them, he's pretty mediocre. But yeah, cool design, cool look. Next, we have the fifth brother. The fifth brother has been both in Star Wars Rebels and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Much prefer his appearances in Star Wars Rebels to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Amongst, villains, he is a brute, doesn't do much, does a lot of fighting, grunting, yelling. I'd say C tier.
Easy C tier for me. I actually don't mind his portrayal in Bison King in Obi-Wan Kenobi, especially if your speakers are well adjusted, you can kind of hear the two different intonations of his character. And our next villain is a certain Gallius Rex, probably the most interesting villain introduced in Star Wars that most people don't know about. I mean, he is the villain of the Aftermath trilogy, kind of groomed by Palpatine from an early age. I'd put him as a bottom of B character for me because I liked a lot of what I read from him. He was the most compelling villain for me and was a great foil to Sloane and their two different ideologies.
I would also say bottom of B. I think he's very fascinating, but most of his development comes in Empire's End, so we don't even really get much. He's more mysterious in the first two books. Then the third one, he gets more development. I think he's very cool, really good concept. Would like to see more. Next, we have Gar Saxon. Gar Saxon is one of the more interesting Mandalorian villains that has been created in the animated stuff, both in Rebels and in Clone Wars. I've really enjoyed what they've done with this character. That being said, though, I would still put Gar Saxon in B.
If we were to solely base him off of his Rebel appearances, which is probably the most time we spend with him, I would have put him as a C. However, Son of Dathomir and Season 7 of the Clone Wars lets him be a little bit more in his prime. Yeah, I'd keep him at his bottom of B. I do like his ending too. Our next villain is General Grievous. Iconic design, the coughs, the whole lightsabers being collected. Like he's got so many cool things, but also the incompetence, always scampering away. Like he's a villain who's a lot more bluster than he is actually like real conviction and effectiveness. I still feel like canon has to make some sort of connection to being such an effective sudden enemy in the beginning of the Clone Wars and then becoming like the coughing, wheezing, annoying sort of villain that he is for the rest of the time. I would put him as bottom of B or mid B. Like I think it's just quantity over quality for him in a lot of times.
I'd put him mid B. I think with a little bit of that 2003 stuff getting canonized, I can dream that we'll see an adaptation of those two fights, especially the first one. Yes, he is a villain that fails more than he succeeds. That being said, the iconic nature of him, some of the episodes and the kind of the story legacy of the character would put him in B for me. Next, we have General Hux. I find that he is a serviceable, crazy villain throughout both The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. Towards the end of The Last Jedi, they start to use him more comedically. And then in The Rise of Skywalker, I really, really, really do not like anything that he does in The Rise of Skywalker. Do not like him as the spy. I'd probably put him in D or F.
I can see top of D or bottom of C. I still think he's something more than a Bib Fortuna or Deva Lompop. Yeah, I don't think he was ever a character truly utilized and developed correctly. Like it seemed like every movie had a different vision. So I'd put him at the very bottom of C. So that brings us to our successor for him in The Rise of Skywalker, General Pride. I think the character does the most with what he's given in the film. He tries his hardest. I do like him killing Hux. That was like, oh, if it is a little silly, I was happy with that. But we don't have anything with him, so I'm willing to put him as a top of D. I think if we flesh him out, he could have the potential to grow into something more.
I agree. Pride should be important, but he hasn't gotten pretty much no development at all. I think he's kind of a parody villain in The Rise of Skywalker. I'd put him in D as well. Next, we have General Veers. General Veers really also does not have much character development in the films, but he's got some iconic scenes. He is the most competent of all the Imperial officers, I guess, save Piett in The Empire Strikes Back. He succeeds in pretty much everything he does. I'd put him in C.
I think I might actually push for bottom of B. I find his competence to be very much the core part of his character. I like that he got his hands dirty too. He is a general, and yet he's leading the ground assault. I'd say bottom of B.
I'm okay with that. I like that point about him getting his hands dirty.
Then we can move on to Governor Price. Governor Price apparently has had a lot of development in other materials. That being said, she doesn't. I don't know. I feel like she needed more time to do crazier things in the show. Maybe a C. I don't know. I feel like this is an open book for me.
I was going to say bottom of B. She does get a lot of character development in the first Thrawn book by Timothy Zahn in canon, but there, similar to Thrawn in all of Zahn's books about Thrawn in canon, she is more of an antihero, so it is a little harder to grade her villainous stuff she does in that. I think she is the most competent besides Thrawn Imperial villain in Rebels. I'd say bottom of B. Next, we have one of the more interesting character designs throughout canon comics, and that is Grakkus the Hutt. I've really enjoyed what they've done with Grakkus the Hutt. I think he's unique and different when it comes to Hutts, and I think as kind of a collector of sorts of different artifacts, and really he is kind of one of the more pure evil Hutts. He's willing to try to climb that ladder and achieve. I think I'd put Grakkus in B.
This was a little complicated because I think when we see Grakkus at the beginning, quite fun. I like his whole arena setup and everything, having all of that stuff. That all of that is positively cool. I'll agree with you. Same position. I do like a lot of his character traits, and I also like his walking leg things. Our next villain is probably one of the most iconic characters in Rebels, the Grand Inquisitor. Really loved him in Rebels. I loved him as like the light side force vision in Rebels. I loved him in the Star Wars comics where he's forced to still persist around at a High Republic temple as like an evil dark specter. And then the Obi-Wan Kenobi show happened, and I was not expecting me to like, especially the design. I could push for like a B, maybe an A.
I was going to say bottom of A. I think amongst Disney canon villains, he's one of the more iconic. He's been given multiple layers. And I think he has room to even grow in the future. I think the Charles Soule comics are one of my favorite appearances of him. And in season one of Rebels, he is one of my favorite aspects. So I'd say probably top, bottom of A. Next, we have Grand Moff Tarkin. Grand Moff Tarkin is probably the most iconic Imperial ever. Been given so much development in novels, comics, TV shows, and movies. One of those well rounded characters from all parts of Star Wars media. I'm really also on the fringe with him, as well as, where Boba Fett and Dooku were. But I think right now I'd probably put him at the top of A.
I really enjoyed the Tarkin novel and especially his background on Ariadu and what that means for him. But I've liked that layering that we've added to him of like he's a psychopath instead of just a straight villain. So yeah, easy A. I hope we get more from him, honestly. Our next character is the Great Progenitor, who, if you don't know, is one of the Drengir. Fun villain. I will say very unique in the sense that we haven't really had a villain like this in Star Wars. I would say bottom of B. I really enjoyed how they used it.
I think Great Progenitor as a stand-in for the Drengir as a whole, I would definitely say bottom of B, and that's kind of the way I used him in this tier list. I didn't want to put groups in, but since all the Drengir are so connected and the Great Progenitor is kind of the centerpiece of the hive mind, I enjoyed them as villains even if they didn't really go as far throughout the initiative as I wanted them to. So B for me. So next on the list is Greedo. Greedo, obviously one of the most iconic scenes in all of Star Wars and has been developed a little bit in extended material. That being said, though, mostly for the scene, I would still ride the line between C and B though because of how iconic his scene is.
I would give him a C. I'm enjoying his character work in the Han Solo and Chewbacca comics. And then our next villain is the most hilarious villain of them all, and that's Hondo Ohnaka. Only really shown in the Clone Wars and Rebels and some stuff with Batu in the Galaxy's Edge comics. God, he's just a fun villain. I like how he can turn up the charm. Sometimes it can get very dark and serious, especially like with the mutiny stuff. He's kind of down on his luck in Rebels, and his look is very bland, I will admit. But the character itself is so fun, and I like his shenanigans with Ezra. I would give him an A.
I would also give him an A, and I think mostly just looking at his Clone Wars appearances, where he is a villain in Clone Wars. For all
Yeah.
intents and purposes, he is a villain throughout the entirety of Clone Wars, before making the more anti-hero turn in Rebels, and then in extended material like Galaxy's Edge. But I think he is arguably one of the top 3 villains in Clone Wars with Cad Bane and Maul. He is like a completely other side of villain than we had seen in Clone Wars, really, and he's hilarious. I love him. Next, we have IG-88, who, out of all the original bounty hunters from Empire Strikes Back, has probably gotten the least amount of development in canon, despite how awesome his design is, and it's despite IG-11 kind of giving us a look at what it would be like to see IG-88 in action and live action. I'd still probably say towards the bottom of C for me.
Honestly, I'd even push for him to be D tier because he's literally just the cantina head stings the drink canisters in Mos Eisley. But he's a bottom of C, and he needs to feel different if he shows up in live action from IG-11. Maybe a bit more Terminator like the way he walks. Our next villain is probably the most grotesque villain in Star Wars, and that is Jabba the Hutt. I'm not the biggest fan of Return of the Jedi, as you might know from this channel, but even if I find everything with Jabba's palace messy, Jabba himself is great. He is a puppet that carries everything. That being said, I don't know. After outside of that, there's not much of him. Like we get some stuff in Clone Wars and all that, but it's really just Episode 6 from him. I would honestly just say B tier.
I've gotta say A tier. There's like 5 types of villains in Star Wars. You've got Sith, you've got bounty hunters, you've got Imperials, you got crime lords, and Jabba the Hutt is the crime lord of Star Wars. He's the in all material, and he's been explored throughout other things. He doesn't have much depth as, most of these like more one note iconic Star Wars villains do. I think if we're going to plug Boba into S, despite a true lack of depth for his villain appearances in canon, I think I gotta put Jabba up an A.
No, that's fair. I think I can agree with that.
Okay, next is Jango Fett. Jango Fett, another tough one because we are looking at Legends, easy S tier. In canon, we have Attack of the Clones and we have some comic stuff. Not really anything else after that. His legacy is iconic throughout the series, but the character himself has yet to be given his true due in canon. Despite all that, like Jabba, I'd still say A tier for Jango Fett.
A tier. I honestly find his armor way cooler than Boba's. Even if Boba's is more of like the guy who doesn't care, but just is like the walking monster. This guy feels like the professional's professional. Our next villain is Jixtus from Thrawn Ascendancy, and this is probably one of the few times on a tier list I can't actually say anything. So I'm just gonna pass it to you, Liam. You know all about Thrawn.
I do, and I love the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, and Jixtus is kind of the maniacal villain behind the entire thing. as one of the leaders of the Grisks. He is this like mysterious, all powerful villain that we still don't know that much about. I'm really tempted to put him at the bottom of the A because I think he is really interesting and quite fascinating. Zahn really writes him quite well, but with the lack of like full development, there's still a lot to come, I think, here in the future from Timothy Zahn for Jixtus and the Grisks. I think I'd put him towards the top of B right now. So next we have Kaiza. Kaiza is our villain from Shadow of the Sith novel, one of the most recent Star Wars novels that has come out this summer. And with Kaiza, I will also include the Mask of Exum Panchard, since we haven't really seen anyone else use it besides Kaiza. I really like this villain. I think they did a great job. And with the 1-2 punch of her and the mask, I think she borders on A for me. I really, really like the mask and the legacy, that chapter about the legacy behind it. And she is a pretty interesting villain herself.
A for me, actually. I know she was introduced technically in the aftermath stuff, but this is really the first time she's actually doing anything. The Exum chapter is so good. That was like an angle of like a Sith warlord. It's not something we've really had other than like maybe Star Wars: The Old Republic. Very cool. Easy A for me. And then our next villain is Krix Kamerat, who is not at all like Kiza or the Mask of Exum. He is just one of these kid villains in the High Republic adventures, but I still like the connections of knowing people who kind of split off in opposite sides of an escalating conflict. I would say like top of C.
I think that's a good spot. A villain with some development, but pretty much a kind of a one note villain nonetheless. And he does have a little bit of that bratty kid vibe. So I would say C as well. Next, we've got Kylo Ren. Kylo Ren will be another one that is going to be a little harder to grade because of his turn, obviously, back to the good side. There's still plenty to explore with Ben Solo and Kylo Ren here in the future, but he is my favorite character in the sequel trilogy. I think carries a lot of that. Adam Driver's performance carries a lot of that material and elevates a lot of the material that might otherwise not be as strong. Easy A for me, and I think on that bubble towards S.
I would push for S actually. I agree. I love Adam Driver and killing Han, iconic scene. Even if he is like bordering between kind of good, kind of bad in The Last Jedi, his final choices were very villainous. I did enjoy that. I liked him being chaotic and out of control too. I think being unable to escape the light, always trying to grab onto the dark was what made him so compelling to me. I find him he's an S tier. I want to see way more of this character post his supposed death than before as well.
Looking at the rest of the list, I tend to also agree. I'm happy dropping him an S.
And moving on, we have Lourna Dee, who is probably one of the more well-developed Twi'leks ever in Star Wars, and really got a shine when a character study with the audio drama of the Tempest Runner. I would push for an A. I really enjoy her villainous side.
She is bubble A to B for me. I was gonna say top of B, maybe around right behind Jixtus for me, but I think she is the easily the second best villain so far throughout High Republic. I think we're going to get characters that are obviously going to surpass her and get close to Marchion Ro based on thoughts on Path of Deceit. But she has been a really, really good villain. Tempest Runner definitely carries her development. I would say top of B, but I can see A as well.
Yeah, I'm fine with that too.
Okay, so next we have the leader of the Nile, Marchion Ro. Marchion Ro, for me, is the best character we've gotten in the High Republic so far, both villain and hero. I find him incredibly interesting in all the plots he has. Extremely interesting. He's an effective villain. He succeeds. He doesn't lose very often. He's manipulative, but also fierce. I really like Marchion Ro, and I would say I would actually put him mid to top A.
See, I would almost push him for an S tier because I think he is already become such an iconic villain. It's just more people needed to be exposed to him. But the downside of that is whatever we've gone so far, he's never really been a main POV characters thus far outside of Eye of the Storm comics. And we're not going to really see him until supposedly phase three, which is a year and a half of a wait for us. So I'm fine with him being like behind Tarkin or ahead of Tarkin. I think what he's gotten so far is so cool. Our next villain is Masameda, who is not the smartest guy, kind of a coward, especially in the Aftermath books. I don't think he's that interesting of a villain. He just kind of feels like a glorified secretary for Palpatine. Maybe a D tier, honestly.
I was gonna say bottom of C. I could also see D as well. We haven't gotten the full development that I think the character deserves. I think he's got a really interesting role in the fact that he's been around since before Palpatine took power, and he's still around all the way through the Imperial reign. I think there's a lot to really discover with this character, but we haven't done it yet. Next is Moff Gideon. Moff Gideon obviously being the main villain of The Mandalorian's first two seasons and probably going to be one of the recurring main villains here in the future. Great performance by Giancarlo Esposito. I've really enjoyed this character. I think we need a little bit more exploration into his depth, like some of the things we hear about that he's done. I want to see. Nonetheless, still A for me.
Easy A. Yeah, I agree. We need to see what happened. The Night of a Thousand Tears or whatever it's called, where he classes Mandalore. It'd be nice to see something of him like kind of rising up to this position if we ever get like a flashback. Our next villain is Moralo Evil, and that being said, I don't know if he's more memorable than just by himself. He's kind of a very whiny guy all around. B.
I was going to say C because he is pretty effective, but he doesn't have much of a role. He dies pretty quickly, doesn't make it out of the Citadel arc. So, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm fine with D. I kind of want to bump Hux down to D. Just Hux drives me crazy.
All right. Okay.
um,
You know what? I will agree. Let's put Hooks down to D.
Mother Talzin, one of my favorite villains from the Clone Wars. Really interesting side of Force magic that we, have gotten to see in the past in Legends, and in canon, really, it's our main look at it. Really enjoy this character. I'd actually say probably bottom of A.
Bottom of A for me. Loved her role in Son of Dathomir. I like her being like this Force witch foil to Palpatine. Like in the fact that she could have been Palpatine's apprentice was also an interesting revelation. Our next character is Night Swan, and I also do not know this character because I never ended up finishing the first Thrawn book. But Liam, what are your thoughts on this guy?
Night Swan is really interesting because it was kind of pitched as the Moriarty to Thrawn's Sherlock Holmes. It's one of the best parts, I would say, of the first Thrawn book is kind of the battle of wits between the two. I'd probably put him towards the top of B. Okay, next is Newt Gunray, and Newt Gunray is a character that has an incredible effect on the Star Wars prequel series. He's a very important character, but the entire time he's also a puppet. He doesn't really ever seem in control. He's greedy. He wants money, and that's why he's there for the Separatists. I could see D. I can for sure. I think there's a funny aspect to this character that I've always enjoyed. So I'd say bottom of C, but if you say D, I'm completely okay with that.
I think I'd have to say bottom C because even if he is very limited in his range as a character. There's the whole greed and the fact that he just wants to kill Padme because of everything that went wrong. And I think he's effectively used, even if he is essentially forgotten in Revenge of the Sith. Nuvo Vindi. If that name does not ring any bells like it did for me, he is the Blue Shadow Virus guy from a very early Clone Wars. But he's just a creepy alien guy. He's not really anything else. F tier for me.
Yeah, this guy's really goofy. This is one of the goofiest Clone Wars villains ever. Definitely F tier. Next is Ochi of Bastoon. Ochi of Bastoon has been one of the most, I would say, different villains we've gotten in the last few years of Star Wars canon. The Darth Vader comic has really made him just a wacko. But I kind of think he's for the better for it. Like he's given such a weird personality that it's made him a bit more endearing. It also made him a bit more memorable than he probably would be if he was just this like cool, calculating assassin villain. Probably say B tier.
I would say B tier because for that personality, I don't think he should be anywhere near as effective as he is. And right now, with the Darth Vader line, it's like, oh, he's Crimson Dawn. No, he's with Vader. He's just the biggest brown noser in the galaxy with the coolest armor at this point. Our next villain is Poggle the Lesser. He's a master strategist. He created the Death Star original plans. I would give him a C tier. I think iconic design.
I'd also say C tier. He's way more important than most people would think. And I think he's more competent than a Newt Gunray. So I would say C tier. Next, we have one of the best villains in Clone Wars, Pong Krell. I feel like I keep getting the guys that I get to say are one of the best villains, but Pong Krell is one of the most interesting, coolest villains in the Clone Wars. One of the best arcs, A tier for sure.
Easy A tier. I mean, he only had 4 episodes really, but his first 4 is already just dehumanizing the clones. But also the fight scenes were amazing, and then having him be killed by his most loyal soldier, great touch. I really enjoyed him. And our next character is Pre Vizsla. Pre Vizsla, honestly, man, he's so cool. Who wants to like do all these things and win and all that. But he also plays by the rules in a strange, interesting way. He has his own code and his willingness to just be killed by Maul. It's dark. I respect it though. I like having him be the catalyst for the return of the classic Mandalorians. Bottom of A for me.
I agree. Bottom of A. I really love everything Pre Vizsla brought to the history of the Mandalorians and canon, and I think he is really the fundamental Mandalorian when we're looking at ideology and like what they might look to explore in the future of the Mandalorian TV show, and played by John Favreau. So you know there's going to be those connections there. Kira, we don't really know her full intentions yet, but I think she is leaning enough towards villain that she has become quite an interesting character. Based on how like villainous her deeds are, that's where I'm struggling where to put her, whether it's B or A. I think she's become an A type character, but are her deeds dark enough to get into A? I'm not sure. I'm fine with A or B.
I'll go with B. I agree with the character stuff. It's very cool, especially what she's become since the solo movie. But we still haven't seen Hidden Empire, and we don't really know what that really holds for us. Crimson Reign is more of her putting the pieces together. I'm very excited for our next character, Ray Sloan. She's grown into the best part of the Aftermath trilogy and was a fun part of A New Dawn. I want more from her. I want to know where she is, what's happened. Like she seems like she's part of the First Order beginnings, or maybe she has her own wild stuff that she diverts from. She has some very strong morals too, which is very interesting to see as an imperial of that level. Top of B, bottom of A.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same range. I think since A is so exclusive, I think probably top of B. But she is a really interesting villain who we can still learn more about. No matter what we do with Riva, there's going to be controversy. I think Riva ultimately rounds out into a pretty interesting character, but like we said when we were reviewing Obi-Wan Kenobi, there needs to be a lot more for Riva to be a complete character. I think as a villain, she is one track minded. She is revenge oriented and she's just out to get Vader no matter what. And no matter who's in her path, she's going to deal with them if it gets her closer to her goal. I would say somewhere in B for me.
I'd say she's like upper half B. I do like the villainy parts to her, and I liked how she kind of breaks down at the end. But that being said, not enough there for 6 episodes. We need more from her. Hopefully, she's in Jedi Survivor or something. Our next villain is Rook Cass, mostly a character in scenes of the Clone Wars season 7 and Son of Dathomir. Not much else to her. I'd give her C.
I agree. C, she's one of our least explored Mandalorians, despite her being pretty cool. Next, we have Rook is a little bit more developed in the Legends timeline, but is more villainous, I would say, in this timeline. Rook is kind of one note though in Rebels, doesn't it has cool moments and gets utilized quite well, but doesn't really have too many character defining things about him. I would put him in C.
Yeah, I mean, the Rook that's in Legends with Heir to the Empire, that's the one that everyone wants to see. His story has ended unless he somehow survived. I do think we have to put him as a C character. All right, our next villain is Rune Hako, and if you, like me, did not know who he was, it's not because you didn't read a book or something. You've seen him. He's in the Phantom Menace next to Newt Gunray. Yeah, that's that guy. Not much else to him. I'll give him a D tier.
Yeah, I definitely bottom of D, maybe even F. Stunted slime, I believe Palpatine calls him. Next is Savage. Savage, another great Clone Wars villain. Love his entire arc. Does some incredible things. Great fighter. I'd put him in A.
Yeah, I could see him in A. I almost want to push for S because I think he's such an impactful character for redeeming Maul. Once he gets him teamed up with Maul, he does become the secondary character. He doesn't really get to stand out on his own as much as I wish he could have. Our next one is Sebulba, probably the greatest pod racer alive until he finally loses to Anakin after trying every deep sheep dirty trick. I don't know. He's not really a villain for me. He's just a shitty guy. I'd give him a C.
Yeah, I guess villains from your certain point of view, he is the obstacle in Anakin's way, the antagonist for the middle act of Phantom Menace. I'm fine. Yeah, I think C, top of C. Next, we've got the second sister or Trilla. Trilla is a fantastic villain in Jedi Fallen Order. I really enjoyed this character's arc and kind of what they did a little bit with Riva, but to a much more developed level. Trilla for me is bottom of A.
I will also go bottom of A. She is the looming threat. She has one of the best fights. How she gets killed by Vader is amazing too. Our next villain is Sergeant Creel. He's in the 2015 Star Wars line as the guy who first teaches Luke how to really do some lightsaber combat. Top of C for me. I don't think he's anything awesome after his initial training and his initial turns. I think he falls off pretty hard.
I agree. I think he's a really cool design, and kind of inspired by that Macquarie art of getting to see stormtroopers with lightsabers, but not too much depth to his character. C for me. Next is the seventh sister, another character from Rebels and Inquisitor. Much better for me than the fifth brother, but also not developed a whole lot. I would say either towards the top of C or bottom of B.
I would push her to the top of C, not enough for B. Our next character is Snoke, who is an interesting villain. But that being said, I like the type of villain he is. He's the one who like itches and irritates, right? He provokes. I wonder what percent of his life he really was in control and what percent he wasn't. He's a character who needs to be explored a lot, especially because he apparently had to deal with Luke at some time. I'd say bottom of A. Bottom of A. I find The Last Jedi's depiction of him really effective.
I find the depiction effective too, but I just think there's so little story to him. I think he's a character that when he's fleshed out, how did he get away from Palpatine? How did he end up being the guy we see in the Rise of Kylo Ren? What is, really his whole backstory? That could push him to A for me, but right now I think I was gonna say about mid B. So I'd say split the middle, put him towards the top of B. My favorite arc in the Clone Wars is the Mortis arc, and the Sun is one of the best parts. I love the way he is able to tempt Anakin and initially shows him his fate before they all forget what happened. Not too many layers to him, obviously, because he is the embodiment of the dark side. Visually, as the character, he's very cool. I think he gives some of the best moments in that arc. I'd say top of B for me.
Top of B. I think he is very cool. That arc is also very strange. Next villain is one of my favorites, actually, Terran Malicos. I really loved him in Jedi Fallen Order and what he did, placing the Night Sisters on Dathomir, essentially. I push for bottom of A.
My initial thought was also bottom of A, so we can go with that. But I think there is a lot more to learn about this character. I want to learn more about his backstory and really, what makes him into who he is in Jedi Fallen Order. And also, if we're just talking about the hardest fight by far in the entirety of the game, throw him up in A for difficulty because he is quite difficult to beat.
Yeah.
Next is the client, iconic for being Werner Herzog. Not too much else to the character. I'd say C.
I mean, he's very effective in the role, but he's not really anything more than that. Killed pretty quickly. There's not really much going on with him. Our next one is probably the most iconic villain never introduced in a movie, Thrawn. I don't need to say much about him. You know way more about him than I do. And I enjoyed him in Rebels and what I've read in both Legends and Canon. S tier. Simple as that.
Absolutely S tier. Even with a more anti-villain type of role that he's been given throughout Zahn's books as the lead, I still think he's good enough in Rebels. He will be good enough in the Mandalorian stuff and the spinoff. And the stuff that he does is anti-hero enough in his own books that I would definitely throw him in S still. So next we have Toro Calican. Toro Calican is the villain of season 1, episode 5, The Mandalorian, aka the worst episode of the series by far. F tier.
F tier. I don't have to say anything else. Our next one is Unkar Plutt. The portion lines are great memes, especially when the sequels are first coming out. I don't really care much about him. I would honestly say D tier. There's not really much there.
Yeah, I'll go with you there. Pretty evil to take food from people, but yeah, he's not much of a villain, but he's enough to be considered for this list. But yeah, D tier. Next, we have Vice Admiral Rampart, who I think has become a very interesting, ruthless early Imperial in Bad Batch. Enjoyed what they've done with this character so far, but obviously we're far from the final package with this character. Based on his early appearances, though, I'd probably say B. I think he's going to have a very important place in Imperial history.
I mean, it feels like he's connected to Wayland, the stuff that he did on Rylot, the introduction. It's kind of being like the Tarkin second in command, right? Like yeah, all that stuff is very cool in Bad Batch. B tier easily. Our next villain is Volt Scaris, and if you remember, he's the Rebels instructor for the Imperial pilots. It's kind of an annoying instructor, even if he is following the rules. D tier, maybe C tier. I don't really care too much about him.
Yeah, I think because he doesn't do really anything that offensive, I'd say bottom of C. Next, we have Wat Tambor, who would have been lower, in my opinion, until the Bad Batch arc in Clone Wars. I think we get a really kind of scary, ruthless version of Wat Tambor in there. Still without much character development. I was gonna say C, but I think he might be the most interesting of the two other separatists we have in this list.
I could see bottom of B, top of C. The fact that he was directly involved in like using Echo in his programming and like making him into like a cyborg droid, and I think C is fine for me. Our next guy is Worm Loathsome, the guy who had tea with Obi-Wan at the Battle of Christosis. But he's so easily falling into a trap of like delay, delay, delay. I would give him a D tier.
Yeah, I'd say D or F. He's he's pretty goofy. Classic Star Wars name though, Worm Loathsome. Next, we have Zam Wessel, another character victim of the canon only part of this tier list. She really does not have much exploration at all. Little tiny bit in comics, and then you got Attack of the Clones. I'd probably say C tier because of that.
C tier as well. I liked a lot of the stuff with her in Legends. We need more from before the movie, honestly, to flesh her out as a character. The next one is Zero the Hutt, and Zero the Hutt is character I think ages pretty poorly these days. D tier.
Yeah, I was gonna say F tier. Zero is really kind of obnoxious and just like
Yeah,
finishing it off with Zuckuss. Zuckuss has been given quite a bit of character development, as we talked about all the way back at the beginning of this video with 4 LOM, and has been one of the funnier, more endearing parts of Bounty Hunters as an anti-hero who leans on the side of villain. I'd probably put him towards the top of C or bottom of B.
I put him bottom of B. I like a lot of the stuff that he does. He's a very nice guy, and he's the weird force sensitivity that he has. I'm fine with bottom of B.
Well, then that does it. That's our tier list. We have a lot of characters here. Thank you all so much for watching and bearing with us through all 90 characters that we just ranked. Hope you guys enjoyed all that. Let us know down in the comments below who are your top tiers and bottom tier characters. Did you like our rankings? Do you think we did a good job? What would you change about it? Let us know in the comments below. And again, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. That'll really help us out as we move into the future with our channel. Only your subscriptions are the way to show us that you really love our content. So please subscribe and also hit that like button as well so we know that you enjoy the video. Stay tuned for the rest of the week. We will be having our Andor videos as always on Wednesday and Friday. Also stay tuned for the future of the month. We have a lot more videos coming out, including a second Halloween special next week and more Andor coverage, as well as our Legends Book Club about Death Troopers, the main horror novel in Star Wars. We are going to be doing a lot of villain horror theme stuff here for the next couple weeks as we round out October. So thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.